So we've got our reference set up correctly. Let's start blocking out our shape. I'm going to make sure that I'm in the modeling context here so I can get access to all my modeling tools across the top. And I'm on the polygon shelf. I've got my polygon shelf showing here where I can get access to all of my geometric primitives. Now I can also create a lot of these polygon shapes under the create menu under polygon primitives just here. I'm going to use this menu in this case. It's worth noting at the top where you see these little dots, that means that you can rip off a menu. So I'm just going to click on it here and it'll pop out. And if I had a lot of shapes to create, this would be a little bit quicker. And the reason that I'm going to use this menu just for now as opposed to the shelf is it allows me access to the option box. You'll see these option boxes in lots of different menus in Maya. So let's click on the one for cube here. It gives me the initial creation options for the polygon cube command. And by default, I'm creating cubes that are 1 by 1 by 1 and that have just one polygon on each side of the cube. And there are some other options down here. Now, if I change the options here, this menu is sticky. So if I was to change it to, for example, 2 by 2 by 2, every time I create a cube, either with this button or with this button here, it would use these options until I go edit and reset the settings back to the default. Normally I leave things at their default, but it's just good to know that these option boxes are where you go to set your initial creation settings. So we'll close that window down by hitting create there. I'm going to close this guy as well. And here is my initial cube, and it's created right at the origin, and more often than not we want to model around the origin of the world, and the origin is just 0, 0, 0, so the center of the world. So here's my cube, and I am going to try scaling it up, and I might need to do this just a few times just to drag it out a little bit. So just over this viewport I'm going to hit 4, and that's going to put me into wireframe mode. I'm just going to hit spacebar as well, and that's going to full screen it for me. So we can see that the fork in this case is not in the center of the image. It's just slightly off to the right hand side. Now I could move the cube, but it's probably a better idea to move the image plane slightly instead. And that's because I'd like to keep my model at the center of the world if I can. So I'm going to select the 2 image planes in my outliner just here. If you can't see your outliner, you can hit this button. And I'm just going to move it over just a small little bit. So something like this. Outside of this small little tweaking that I'm doing now, I normally don't want to be able to select them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them onto their own display layer. Now I could turn them on and off using this display layer. I actually want to keep the visibility. I want to be able to see them. I just don't want to be able to select them, because it'll get very annoying if I'm selecting them instead of selecting my cube. So with both of those selected, I hit this button here. That means these 2 objects were added into this layer. I can test this by clicking on and off the visibility. If it was a case that one of these didn't get added, I could reselect the object and then right click and say add selected object. I can also remove the selected object from the current layer if I make a mistake and put the wrong object on the wrong layer. I'm not looking to hide the visibility here. What I want to do is click on this 3rd button to reference it, and that means that I won't be able to select it. So I can still see it, but I can't select it, and that's exactly what I want. I'm going to go back and select my cube that we created. I'm going to try scaling it down just a small bit, and I'm going to move it down to just around here. The cube is now roughly aligned to the shape of the handle, and this is quite similar to what we had earlier when we were discussing how a modeler breaks down a shape in Photoshop. Here's the Photoshop scene we were looking at earlier. We can see here that we had blocked out the initial shape of the handle. We were going to then stretch up our shape to roughly match out the block outline of the base of the fork just here, and then we were going to look at extruding up those sections. And to achieve that, we needed to add some extra lines running down along the center of our shape. Now we need to do this in a certain order within Maya. So coming back over to Maya, if we look at our cube, we could stretch up these vertices by going into subcomponent mode. So I right click and I can go to vertex, and I can grab these vertices and I hit W and I can move them up. And then I could move them out, and I could move them out individually if I want to, but the easier way to do this is to hit R on the keyboard and scale out, so I can scale them both out from the center at the same time. And that's quite a handy little trick to practice, because it keeps everything symmetrical. So I could do this, and then I could go back to object mode, and I could bring up my attribute editor for the box, and I could go to the polycube tab. And here we have the original settings, the original creation settings for our cube. I could come in here and I could try and increase the subdivision width here to add some extra lines. And the problem is, it is going to destroy my shape. That is not what I expect. To get access to these initial creation settings are very useful right at the start, but as soon as we start editing our shape at a subcomponent level, so vertices, edges or faces, we can't go back in time and adjust these. So if I want to add some extra cuts right at the start of the process, I can do so by changing these numbers, but I need to do so before I go into subcomponent mode. So I'm just going to undo moving those vertices. I'm going to put them back to where they were. And now if I come into my polycube, I can increase the subdivision width here, and I get these extra lines, which is what I'm expecting. And it doesn't break the shape. So just to be clear, these initial creation settings, you can adjust them as much as you like. I could put in more cuts going along the horizontal now if I wanted to. But you need to do so right at the start. As soon as we go into subcomponent mode and start editing things, if you come and try and change these settings, it will break the shape. Okay, so I've added 5 to my subdivision width here, and that should be enough for now to get me these shapes. So this will be one prong, this will be the center prong, and this will be the right hand side prong here. So that looks good. So I'm going to select these vertices now. I'm going to hit W and I'm going to drag them up to the top here, and I'm going to do my little scale trick again, and I'm going to scale them out just like so. Now that matches our original plan from Photoshop quite well. So I now have a polygon face here that I can extrude up, and another one here and another one here. Now we've been working in this front view. It is important to jump out of here and take a look at what's happening in the perspective view, and I can see that so everything looks still fairly neat. I'm going to try and keep things symmetrical and flat for as long as I possibly can. So when I am selecting in the orthogonal view here, it is selecting both sides of my shape, not just the front vertex. It selects both sides all the way through. Okay, and I can see that I've got a polygon face here, here and here. If I was to jump into face mode, I could select this face, and holding shift I could select the next face, and you can see my gizmo is getting in my way here, so I'm going to hit the minus key to make it a little bit smaller to move it out of my way. Holding shift, I'm going to click the middle and then the right hand side, and I'm going to extrude up. So there's lots of different ways to access all of these commands, including the menus, which I highly recommend you go through. So I'm going to use marking menus, and I'm also going to use the modeling toolkit, which is this button just up here, and here is my extrude option. Now it feels like my gizmo is a little bit too small, so I'm going to hit the plus key. There we go. Now I can drag this up by eye, so I can start to drag up here. I'm going to see that my local translate is the option that's changing here. I could also click on this attribute and I could drag over and back to change it just here. And I can see that it's starting to drag out my prongs for me. I really need to be in this view, I think, to be a bit more accurate. And I'm just going to pull up to just about here. Okay, now I can use the offset if I want to scale those faces at the end. So that's roughly matching my reference geometry. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to hit W just to come out of that too. And I'm going to right click and go back to object mode. I'm going to hit spacebar just to come out of this view. So in the perspective view with my model selected, I can see the light green wireframe over the top. If I deselect, it disappears, and I see the smooth shaded version of the fork. It's still feeling very basic at the moment. As I move through the modeling process, I would like to be able to see the wireframe on the fork all of the time. It's very useful to be able to see how the mesh is laid out. And I can do that by going to shading and turning on wireframe on shaded. And that keeps the wires on the fork whether I have it selected or not. Now the next thing to do will be to add some horizontal lines and to add in some details for the neck of the fork. Before we do that, I'm going to save this file out, and I'm going to save this out as initial as blocking. So model blocking. Just change that back to V1 take 1 of that stage. And I'm going to save that out now. And this is the initial model blocked in. And much like the Photoshop file that we had earlier on, we have a blocky version of our fork with these areas extruded up, and we have enough vertical detail. So in the next section, we're going to add some of the horizontal detail to get the shape of the neck. We want to add as little detail as possible while still holding up the shapes, but we're definitely going to need to add some horizontals in here to get this kind of curve shape running down along the body of the fork. And we'll do that in the next section.